Hello and welcome to Pancreatic Cancer UK's first ever Facebook Live Q&A. My name's Chris Gerard, I'm part of the media team here at the charity. Usually that means being asked questions by journalists, and when that happens, one of the first people I turn to is the man sat next to me, Head of Research at Pancreatic Cancer UK and fellow Dr. Chris Macdonald. I'm pleased to say that we're changing things around for today, so I'll be asking the questions, your questions. Thanks so much for sending those in. We'll be quizzing Chris on a whole series of topics, including early diagnosis, the challenges of that and what's being done about it, and also about genetics and how understanding more about our genetic makeup could help prevent other people being affected by this dreadful disease. I should say that we're going to try and get through as many of your questions as possible, but if there is something that you've always wanted to ask or you're unsure about, pop us a message on Facebook. If we've got some time, I'll try and squeeze some of those in towards the end. How you doing, Chris?
Yeah, not bad. Full of trepidation, frankly, Chris. We'll see how we get on.
Good stuff, yeah. A new venture.
New venture.
Yeah. Early diagnosis is one of the major focuses for the charity at the moment. It's the focus of our current campaign, Unite, Diagnose, Save Lives, and we're hugely grateful that more than 20,000 of our supporters have raised their hands and pledged their support. So it was only right that we picked out some of the questions from you guys about early diagnosis. I'm pretty new to the cause. A year ago I didn't know anything about pancreatic cancer, so I thought it would be best to start off with something pretty simple. We've seen lots and lots of progress in the last 40 years with other cancers, but very little on pancreatic cancer. Chris, could you tell us what makes pancreatic cancer so hard to diagnose?
In the diagnosis kind of stuff, it's all complicated, but in the basics of diagnosis is that there's not just a simple biomarker. So a biomarker can be anything from kind of a genetic fingerprint, it can be a molecule, a protein in the body that has an indicator of the degree of progression in the cancer, or whether it's there or not, basically. For lots of other cancers, they've had the funding over many years to be able to find those biomarkers, and then they can be used, exploited either in therapy or in diagnosis. But because of the kind of decades of underfunding within pancreatic cancer research, that biomarker for pancreatic cancer just doesn't exist. There's ones around which are all right. They're relatively okay at kind of prognosis. So when someone has been diagnosed, whether they're staging and how far along, whether the therapy has improved anything or not. But for out and out clear detection and early diagnosis, just nothing really exists that's good enough to be relied upon, basically.
Sure. Okay. And as a lot of people will know, we've seen a lot of progress in developing other biomarkers that have then gone on to lead to very effective screening programs. So for breast cancer in particular.
Yeah.
Is it just funding that's holding us back, or are there other factors that have stopped pancreatic cancer researchers making the same headway?
So I suppose the root cause is research, and that then means that the underfunding within research then has those knock-on effects, which means that you don't get those breakthroughs that have been made in other cancers. So because of the lack of underfunding, there's been less of a progression in the basic biology understanding of pancreatic cancer, and therefore targets for therapy and diagnostics just haven't been found. Therefore the following clinical studies have never kind of come and proven definitively in patient groups that it actually works. And also underfunding, researchers, they have careers to maintain, they have livelihoods to live and people to support and families. If the funding's not in that area, it doesn't make a very sound career decision to kind of go that way. Yeah. And as such, if there's funding in breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, cancers where there's been progression and there's kind of good signs and people are seeing that there's interesting things being found and really important kind of revolutions in treatments are being brought on the back of research, people go down those directions. So as a result, I think we wouldn't blame researchers for moving out of the space, but basically, if the money's not there, they're not going to go down it. So you do have this drain, and it's a kind of vicious cycle, because then if you don't have the ideas, you don't have the people, it means that they don't generate kind of interesting grant applications to people like us or the kind of councils and things like that, and they therefore won't fund in the area, and then it just kind of cycles downwards, unfortunately.
Okay, well, thanks for that. That was really interesting. It sounds like, because obviously you could look at the challenges we face purely from a technical, from a biological standpoint. It does look like there's lots of other barriers that people just won't even conceive of quite reasonably.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, that technical one that you pick up as well, because like pancreatic cancer is just a really wily cancer as well. The way it kind of manifests itself, the organ that it chooses to manifest in as well, they're really difficult places to be able to intervene. Like your pancreas is held up in loads of blood vessels in amongst other organs. It's very hard to get to, and then when the cancer does form there, it forms like this protective shield. So even conventional chemotherapies and things like that have been proven really effective in other cancer types, in other solid tumour cancer types as well. So ones that aren't in the blood but actually manifest as a solid tumour in an organ. Ones that work really well just will not get through this protective barrier that coats pancreatic cancer, and then that's just an evolutionary process. That's just it being very good at evading death, essentially.
Yeah. And you talk about evasion. I think one of the things that most struck me when I first kind of began looking into pancreatic cancer not long after joining the charity was how it can remain not dormant but undetected for so long.
Yeah.
What impact does that have from a clinical point of view?
So, I mean, it's awful and it's fascinating at the same time. This kind of the time it takes to actually mature as a cancer. So the study is demonstrating that from the initial point of the tumour initiating till unfortunately that person passing away from pancreatic cancer, it can be 7 years, and it can have this hugely long growth period in which it doesn't affect anything. There'll be no side effects, there'll be nothing manifests itself in the person, and it can just grow and grow and grow until there's this kind of critical mass point where all of a sudden it starts affecting the person really, like, very, very strongly, and all the kind of side effects that we talk about at the charity. And in terms of clinically, this is really interesting because there's so much, the window of opportunity to be able to diagnose someone before it actually gets to a point where it is untreatable anymore. It's so big, but how do you ever find that kind of, what is that marker, what could define those early stages, 6-7 years, to define when it is, where it is, how it can be treated and how it can be diagnosed is a really interesting clinical question. But it is just, I mean, unfortunately, there's just not very many forthcoming biomarkers. Like I said, the genetic components of pancreatic cancer is not that high compared to other cancer types. So there's nothing that you can kind of go, oh, there's a strong genetic marker here that we can use as a biomarker and screen people with routinely, because it just isn't feasible when it doesn't really affect that much of the kind of overall pancreatic cancer population.
Okay, so a real challenge on lots of different levels then.
Oh yeah.
The obvious question, I suppose, and one that's been posed by a huge number of our supporters, both in recent months and I should say during Demand Faster Treatment, which we were incredibly grateful that so many people got behind. We had many people ask us, but what about diagnosis? So, Chris, what about diagnosis? What can we, as Pancreatic Cancer UK and a wider research community, do about it, and what are we doing about it?
So I think what we are and what we can do about it is think about this differently. So it's been decades of no real progression in survival rates of pancreatic cancer, and we have to have like an honest look at ourselves and as a community to kind of really think, we're not doing something right. So as such, we have to think a bit differently. We have to think about changing the paradigm with which we support and, support our researchers to do work in this area. What are the main areas that can really shift the dial, as the Americans would say, in terms of actually delivering better therapy, better care, early diagnosis? So we're thinking about this differently. And because there's been this kind of decades of lack of change, really is driven by early diagnosis. It's a real rate limiting factor in lots of different things, in the therapies, in the clinical trials, in the basic research, in the people saying in the field. If they don't see early diagnosis, there's a very nihilistic attitude. There's kind of like, oh well, if it's that bad, that's terrible, but really, can we do anything about it? We need to change that. We need to change early diagnosis and make sure that it is a reality for people, and that means it drives lots of other things, and we get a positive feedback rather than a negative feedback. So what we're doing as an organisation is that we have worked with the research community. We got them together and asked them, well, we kind of told them really in the lovely workshop that we did a few months ago, in fact a year ago, we got them together and we said we need to crack early diagnosis.
And these are scientists from all across the country at senior level?
Yeah, so all kinds of researchers, but in the space of early diagnosis and pancreatic cancer at various levels of seniority spread throughout the UK. So we brought over 40 of them together and we kind of posed the question, like, what is the thing that you need to do now in order to genuinely bring diagnosis earlier for people with pancreatic cancer?
Sat them down in a room, told them you're not going out again until you've come up with a plan for us to solve this.
Basically, play nice, or we're not letting you out. And also, importantly for researchers, we're not giving you any money either. So we went into the workshop saying that we're going to support with a kind of an investment in research in this area, but we need you to all come together to actually decide what is the most important thing and how you would do it. But really this is around really practically thinking how, with what we have now or what we have within the medium term, what would genuinely change and bring about early diagnosis. So we kind of set them that question, they spent a day hashing it out, and we worked with them to come up with, to be fair, they came up with a proposal, but we kind of finessed a bit in the charity, and we came up with this amazing proposal for Pancreatic Cancer UK's Early Diagnosis Research Alliance, which, do you want me to go into the details of the alliance?
Yeah, if you
so used to going into the details of the alliance.
Well, give it to everyone in less than 30 seconds. So really quickly, what is it that they've come up with? What are they striving for?
30 seconds. Well done, Chris, thank you. So what they're doing is they are uniting and collaborating and sharing their information on 4 key areas of early diagnosis, on helping GPs make better decisions around who they refer for further testing, that biomarker, finding that biomarker and making them as effective as possible, really working out how you efficiently integrate this in real life into the NHS, and then actually testing it as they go along. So they're not waiting for these other results, they're testing about how these things actually work together, and they're all complementary, they all enhance one another, they're carried out by leaders in the field, and it is genuinely the first and largest investment in this specific piece of research that the UK has ever done.
Well, it sounds...
Was that 30 seconds?
I think you're close. And for anyone watching, they might be familiar with some of this from following Unite, Diagnose, Save Lives, the campaign. And they may have seen us talking about the quest for a simple test, so to find the biomarker that you mentioned. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? What might that test look like, and who will use it, and when might it be available?
So it could take the form of, for example, we commented on some research earlier in the year on a breath test.
Yeah.
It could be a breath test. They could find certain molecules in the breath of people that and give you an indicator of whether pancreatic cancer is there or not, or what stage it's at. It could be a blood test. There's lots of other kind of prognostic and diagnostic tests that are done through blood. It could be any number of things. It could be a better way of screening the things that we currently do. It could be a better way of doing these scans and things that are currently in place and are currently the kind of gold standard for indicating and diagnosing pancreatic cancer. So it could, I suppose, take a form in lots of different ways. I think it would be I personally think we've assembled the right team to be able to tell us what the test is. So we could, hypothesize around, that it's going to be this kind of test and it'll pick up these biomarkers and then that'll give you this efficiency. We've put these people together to tell us what these things should be. So if they tell us, actually what we need to do is use what we currently have in a just much more efficient way, then that's really great as well. Like, that's, for me, a simple test. Because if it's done just more effectively, if the tools are already there, then we're going to get there quicker as well. So we're not having to wait for kind of innovation and development. So actually, lots of different combinations of what we currently have and maybe what we are about to have are probably the things that are going to get there. But our team of 40 researchers, led by Professor Steve Pereira, are the people who should be telling us that.
Okay, and we've had a brief joke about getting them all together, and
we will get them all together.
and the challenges of that. But on a slightly more serious tack, how unique is it to have a project like this that isn't just a handful of the brightest minds in the country, but as many of them as we could think of?
Yeah.
How unique is that? You talked a little bit earlier about some of the aspects of research that we don't quite understand.
Mm-hmm.
The challenges of funding, the kind of the personal career drives of researchers, which obviously makes perfect sense, but isn't something that people would naturally think of. What in the context of all of that, how big an achievement is it to get all of these people together, and how serious are they about this?
So, researchers are naturally very conservative cage individuals, and that's absolutely right. The nature of their work and how they get funding and how they publish means that they have to be very kind of secretive about the things they do, the work that they generate, the data and things like that, because really in research you're only as good as your last publication, you're only as good as your last grant. So a lot of them have lived and been taught and kind of worked in this culture of, keep the stuff to yourself until you've published and then you can share it all around. That's probably contributed to the fact that many decades have gone by without any change in pancreatic cancer. So to get them to actually show their homework and share the innovations, the data, the raw data, the stuff that they're kind of working on and statistically analysing and stuff like that, it's actually quite a big deal. It doesn't often happen with great ease, and it didn't happen with great ease, but we encourage them to do so very often. There are some funding platforms by other research funders that are uniquely around this as well, that they're basically around collecting cohorts and data sets. So any researcher working in that field can use that data information. But this one's slightly different in that they're different fields. They're not just data sets. It's information from the biomarkers. It's information from better decision-making tools for GPs. It's the real-time feedback from actually testing it all and changing it as they're going around. So actually to get that coordination and collaboration is actually pretty unique, and we're really proud of it. And I'm personally really proud of those researchers who have gone above their own egos and recognised that this is such a big it's such a big deal, such a rate-limiting step for all of research, and such a big deal for all those people with pancreatic cancer, that they've kind of gone, right, we need to do this differently, we need to share things in order to get genuinely further quicker.
Thanks for that. I mean, it sounds like the project's actually got its own inbuilt momentum in a way. So, as you say, by virtue of how research has worked in the past, there's perhaps been long delays. There's been duplication, maybe.
Yeah. Positive bias, kind of things like that as well.
And that's something that, when putting this together, you, your team, and the Early Diagnosis Research Alliance have consciously sought to prevent.
Yeah, absolutely. And that duplication just can't go on any longer. We can't waste any time. We can't waste any more money. Unfortunately, the spending towards early diagnosis in pancreatic cancer has decreased over the past few years, and that's just criminal when it's so important for the research community, but for people with pancreatic cancer as well. So we're doing everything we can to approach this differently, and not just say early diagnosis is important, understanding what is the barrier towards early diagnosis, and then engineering something that should hopefully overcome those barriers.
And the project that you're overseeing, that's our single, as a charity, that's our single biggest ever investment in early diagnosis research. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I've looked into this because have to make sure that I'm not kind of being hugely incorrect. But I think it's the biggest investment in early diagnosis in pancreatic cancer in the UK.
And aside, obviously, from hopefully we'll find the biomarker. Hopefully, the live clinical trial will result in a tool that we can add to the armory of GPs and clinicians. But beyond that, do you think it might also have the benefit of solving that other issue that you alluded to, the brain drain, if you like, of people that think, God, I need to do something about pancreatic cancer. It's one of the biggest problems of our time, but I can't see how I'd build a career out of this. Do you think this should give us hope on more than one front, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. So I suppose you kind of play the thought experiment of going, what if you did have early diagnosis? So if you did have early diagnosis, for example, the clinical studies that are carried out in pancreatic cancer, unfortunately, the majority fail, and the cold, hard truth of it is that they fail to recruit and fail to retain patients on the study, and that is because pancreatic cancer is so vicious, and because people die either before or during the course of the clinical trial. Clinical trials, therefore, are underpowered and often don't come to a clear, unambiguous answer. It's either this or that. And in clinical trials, that's great. You just want it either way. Either it was negative or it was positive. You don't want something falling in between. So what you would get is really clear clinical trials, and therefore you can have definitive answers on treatments. And therefore the clinical trials would then move on. They would progress and build on just solid quality data. Then you think on what are the impacts then on basic research. So if basic research see that the clinical end is moving, they're all of a sudden going, actually, if we come up with if we're in the labs and we're looking at these new therapeutics and things like that, potentially new interventions for people with pancreatic cancer, but at a very basic level, actually if we did something about this and we could get it to a stage that it could be in a clinical trial, we would feel confident that they could use it and do something effective with it. And as such, this whole everyone's being pulled along by early diagnosis basically, and basically then if you have basic researchers doing the basic research, seeing that there's progression, they'll then move into the area and then they'll be finding interesting results. There's interesting results. Whether you can argue back and forth around whether something positive or negative is an interesting result, but the way that we fund things currently is that if it's an interesting, positive, progressive result, it will more than likely be very compelling for funding. Therefore, these people are more competitive for funding. Money from bigger funders, from Cancer Research UK, from the government and things like that, will then go into pancreatic cancer because they're moving forward, and then there's this positive feed forward loop basically. And funding will, I've said this to you before, is funding will follow the route of least resistance. Yeah. If there's progression, things are moving nicely, the funders like to see stuff done well and to be generating things that look progressive. So basically, if we can undo that kind of knot in the hose of early diagnosis, then hopefully all this stuff will come through as a result of it.
Okay, well, it sounds incredibly promising, and clearly there's lots of the brightest minds on board with this. Just playing devil's advocate a little. A question that I've been asked by a journalist recently is, from what they understand, there are tools already out there. I'm sure our audience, being incredibly knowledgeable, will already know this, but for anyone that is a bit new to the topic, CT scans in particular, why not focus research efforts further down the diagnostic pathway to improve the tools we've already got?
Why not just give everyone a CT scan? So it's a really appropriate question, actually. It's one that it does, on the face of it, think, if you've got something that can diagnose pancreatic cancer, why don't you just do it? So there's two issues here. So a CT scan is an incredibly expensive thing. A GP, if they prescribed CT scans and referrals for CT scans all the time, they would lose all of their budget. The secondary, the cancer unit would be cursing their name that they were sending so many potentially well people for a radioactive scan. Like, it's not great to be putting people under that kind of thing if you haven't got due cause to. So that's one of them. But also, like, for GPs, the symptoms of pancreatic cancer are so vague. So lower back pain, indigestion, fatigue. They probably see those symptoms and combinations thereof in their practices dozens and dozens of times a day. And as such, we can not legitimately or reasonably ask a GP to pick out dozens a day, hundreds a week, thousands and thousands a year, and maybe they'll see a pancreatic cancer patient legitimately once in every 5 years. To be able to pick that one pancreatic cancer patient out of the myriad of people who's displayed similar side effects is just unreasonable to ask of them. Even if you told them, all the time to kind of be aware of it, like, 2 days, I don't know whether you'd be able to keep that in the forefront of your mind, because there's other more pressing things that most of these people do need to have as interventions. But what we need to do is that there are potentially certain combinations of those vague symptoms in duration or severity that can be all linked together in, say, an algorithm, so like a simple kind of checkbox of things that have gone on, which then kind of do a complicated mathematical equation, which then give you an indicator of whether someone should or shouldn't be kind of referred. And in this case, currently it would be for a CT scan, which, still is expensive and maybe not the best way of doing things. But if we could have that combination kind of approach, that, to be fair, one of the strands of the Early Diagnosis Research Alliance is actually focused on, the first work package, is to actually find that combination which then can provide the tools for GPs, rather than telling them what they should do. Let's help them do what they need to do, because they don't want to go not diagnosing people with pancreatic cancer. They get frustrated by this as well. As Unite Diagnose Save Lives has indicated, we really want to, and GPs want the help from us, and that's what we've kind of factored into the Early Diagnosis Research Plans as well.
Okay, yeah, well, I think as we've been talking, you've kind of alluded to a lot of the different kind of groups of people that have got a stake in this. Ourselves, Pancreatic Cancer UK, as a charity, not least all of our amazing supporters, GPs and the researchers. But a big part of my job is talking to the even bigger mass of people outside of there, the general public, if you will, who sadly have very rarely heard of pancreatic cancer, don't know a lot about the symptoms, incredibly vague, very common that you've talked about, and you mentioned the worried well. Obviously, we don't want to unduly frighten anyone, but one of the questions that we got through from one of our supporters on social media kind of touched on this wider group of people, the general public, and what more we could do around prevention. We talk a lot about making people aware of the disease, about what to look out for, when to go and talk to their doctor, but we all as people owe it to ourselves really and our loved ones to have half an eye on how we can help ourselves and help each other really. And they wanted to ask you, for all of the good work we're doing around diagnosis and detection, what do people need to be aware of around prevention? What is it about our health and lifestyle factors that people like me need to make the general public aware of to try and stop this disease in its tracks, really?
Yeah, so this is a difficult one. Prevention, I mean, yeah, I completely sympathise and empathise with people, really pushing on prevention stuff because, what's the best form of therapy? It's not having to treat it in the first place and to avoid this altogether. Generally, this is a difficult one in terms of, so there's a small genetic component to pancreatic cancer. The vast majority of pancreatic cancer, so 99% is sporadic. So that could be to do with environmental factors, well that could be generally just because of the way your machinery works on that day and it happened to make a mistake and then all of a sudden it's pancreatic cancer. But in the grand scheme of things, if we're talking broad prevention, there has been links associated, not huge clear ones, but really interesting stuff that again we commented on recently around obesity and the link between pancreatic cancer and obesity. And in fact, most cancers, there's many obesity-related cancers. So one of the things, in a broad sense, and for lots of different cancers as well as pancreatic cancer, is obesity and bringing down the kind of just the BMI of individuals can be really helpful in order to basically prevent multiple cancers, including pancreatic cancer.
And am I right in thinking that it's the excess weight that causes inflammation, and that's what on a cellular level starts then to change the mix, to introduce the potential for faults in the machinery?
Yeah, really interesting. I'm glad we got at least a little bit geeky at some point. So the idea is that if you have, it's basically an excess stress on the system. So, and that's felt at a cellular level. And those cells then begin to react to that stress by producing specific molecules, inflammatory markers and things like that, which will then go on to basically perturb everything around it. They don't like this stress, they don't like the association of what comes along with an excess of fat in the body. And as such, they do basically contribute to DNA not repairing as effectively, or potentially cross-linking, as they call it, in certain circumstances as a result. But also inflammation is a big driver of and is associated with lots of kind of cancers, and also immunity. So kind of the obesity and the way it triggers and reacts in your immune system also has been linked to the way that drives cancers as well. So that's a really interesting one as well. You've been doing your homework, Chris.
It happens again.
It goes in.
Would you say obesity is now would it be fair to say that that's the biggest lifestyle factor challenge, if you like, that we face now, given that smoking seems to be on the decline?
Yeah, I mean, smoking cannot be kind of, even though it's reducing, basically, if you smoke, all cancers go up by a huge percentage. So if you're looking for prevention, and your easiest way of doing it is to cease smoking. But obesity is a huge, aging population, a Western population in the UK, much more calorific intake than it actually expends. And as such, it is a big deal. I think it was the chief scientific officer basically said that there is only one silver bullet, and it would be to walk, I think, 30 minutes a day. I mean, that she basically was that unequivocal about if people can be healthier and as such reduce obesity and being overweight, that can affect so many things other than cancer as well. So it's an incredibly important thing to be able to reduce and maintain a lower BMI is really important.
Sure. Well, thanks for that, Chris. For the final part of this, I wanted to take a look at the iPad and see the questions that we've had through from you. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to hand over the filling duties to you for a minute, Chris, and
Okay.
whilst I try and get the technology together.
No, it's all right. So what I'm still going to ad lib at you, Chris, just in case.
Good stuff.
I think we had some questions around the kind of genetic stuff around BRCA mutations and things like that. And there's been stuff in the press recently about a new clinical trial that was looking at the BRCA mutation and looking at how it could be essentially targeted in pancreatic cancer, and they had some kind of positive results. It is really positive. I think anything that can kind of increase the disease-free progression, as they called it, of people with pancreatic cancer who have this mutation, so the BRCA mutation, which I should say is normally associated with breast cancer. So there is a small association of BRCA with pancreatic cancer. So they basically did a study and they showed that there was an increase in disease-free progression in people with with metastatic pancreatic cancer who had the BRCA mutation following a certain chemotherapy. So this drug is obviously really interesting, and that's really great. And I think there's positives to take from it. Is that that's great in that we've been talking about years and years of nothing happening. Yeah. So any small progression is great. And it's also really great for those individuals who we can find that they have that mutation and they can quickly get onto the drug that's appropriate for them as fast as possible, so they can get as much effective treatment as possible.
More personalised treatment.
Exactly, it's this precision personal treatment that's coming on through all of kind of medicine. But there are some kind of so there's kind of we looked over the media stuff, and we were trying to think about what should we talk about, how should we approach this, and I think it's important to kind of just always have, not necessarily skeptical, but kind of try and play devil's advocate with the information that's been given. So when they say revolutionize pancreatic cancer or things like that, stalling pancreatic cancer, it's in a certain subtype. The genetics of pancreatic cancer, it's not a big driver like it is in, say, breast cancer and ovarian cancer, so it's not a huge component of it. So we try to think of the wider kind of group of people with pancreatic cancer that we support, and as such we should be kind of managing expectations in that it's not necessary. It won't affect everyone. It's really important and might be the basis of further studies that could help lots more people. Yeah. But also, it's important not diving at the deep end. It was disease-free progression, but it wasn't overall progression. Yeah. So between the placebo and the drug arm, the people didn't live significantly longer. So it's great that there's an interesting finding, but I think it requires more research. It's a great jumping off point, like we say, one of those results that maybe is a springboard for more interesting research. But I think people should not necessarily be really skeptical, like I say, but just to take it in its whole and to be kind of wary of sensationalization within the media.
Yeah, I think perhaps understandable in some respects, given what we've been talking about, that there's been so little progress for Absolutely. So long that people not unreasonably, journalists included, will kind of grasp onto causes for optimism, perhaps. And as you're saying, I think always good to be optimistic that this work is being done and it is finding and reaching new conclusions, but that we need to look at that over a longer period before we can make the change. Sticking with the theme of genetics, we've had lots of questions through from Facebook. I've got time for just a couple. So for anyone that isn't aware perhaps of the wider context around this, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, has recently been talking about genetic testing and how he wants to see this become more widespread. I should say that his remarks are focused on common cancers, but obviously, as we've been saying, there's a lot to do to help our understanding of pancreatic cancer too. One of our spores has been in touch, as I say, they've been selected as part of a genetic research project looking at the BRCA genes. They'd like to know whether it's possible for family members to be tested to try and understand whether families are at more risk. Is that something that you could touch on a little bit?
Yeah, so I think I'm not a clinician. I don't know exactly, but I have some kind of personal experience with friends and myself in that I think generally if people have within their family have parents or family members who have the mutation in the BRCA, then I think they generally, their family members are also kind of screened and tested to make sure that they do or they don't. And if they have inherited that mutation, then they will be monitored for screening. So I think that already exists. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure there's because there's such a strong familial link of that mutation, then they should be on kind of screened, and then they can pick things up very quickly, and they can get the treatment as effectively as possible, as soon as possible. So I think there is genuinely for those people, definitely there's that familial link. We support kind of a familial registry, the EuroPac study, which is kind of like is a big data set of families with a heritable history of pancreatic cancer in the family and close family. I think it's really promising. I wouldn't over-egg it and say like it will be the thing that will kind of revolutionise or form a prevention kind of or screening system. But for those individuals, like I said, with the kind of that new drug, like for those individuals with those mutations in their family and that they carry themselves, it is really important. So if they are there, then they should be monitored. But again, it's not, like I said before, like most of pancreatic cancer is sporadic. So 90-95% is not driven by a specific mutation. So we should be kind of cautious in that it will be important for some people, but when we talk on a wider kind of overview of everyone, it's important not to get distracted by a certain thing, and we should be kind of trying to think in a more holistic fashion, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense. If someone has been affected by pancreatic cancer and they are kind of keen to look into genetic testing to see whether there could be a hereditary link, what's the best way to go about it? Is it to speak to their medical team and put that request in? Can people, for example, get involved with EuroPac English?
So I probably shouldn't be telling anyone to kind of do a certain thing. I think they should go away and basically, Google is good for some things, but I would suggest that our website is even better. So if you go onto our website, there's incredible information there from the team that will give you kind of lots of detail around BRCA and other genetic associated kind of mutations with pancreatic cancer, and there'll be various links from there. They can go to EuroPac from there if they wanted to. But yeah, I think maybe first kind of port of call would be our website because the information is excellent.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm sorry to say that we've run out of time, but thanks very much for watching. I've really enjoyed this, Chris. Perhaps we should do it again.
Yeah, maybe make a series.
Cheers.
Cheers.
See you later.